Welcome, everyone. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager at Catholic Family News, and today we're joined by a very special guest, Charles Coulombe. Charles is a prolific writer, of course, of many books, including Puritan's Empire, Star-Spangled Crown, Blessed Charles of Austria, A Holy Emperor, and His Legacy, along with many other articles. He's also a longtime advocate for monarchism and the co-host of Tumblr House's Off the Menu podcast. Thank you so much for being on the show here today, Charles. How have you been?
Oh, very well indeed. Thanks for inviting me, and a merry ongoing Christmas.
That's
Happy
right.
New Year, and of course, Happy Epiphany.
Of course, of course. Well, you know, I saw your posts about your trip here in America recently, and I was like, we have to have him on to talk about Los Angeles and Hollywood. And the reason is because I think a lot of people associate you, of course, with monarchism, with the Habsburgs, and particularly we see that flag in the back there. But I don't think a lot of people know about your experience in Los Angeles and Hollywood. And just to start things off, how was it growing up in the Hollywood, Los Angeles area as a Catholic? And have you seen it change much since growing up there? I know even in my time that I spent in Hollywood as an actor, I saw it change a bunch. I'd like to get your take on that.
Well, let me see. How do I handle that? Well, you should know that my parents were actors. That's how they met. They were radio actors initially. They met at the Lux Theater of the Air.
Yeah.
And my dad's family had been into it for quite a while. My mother went into acting primarily because it annoyed her father, but also she was very good at it. She could do 5 voices in one broadcast. So she was the first woman to break into radio in 15 years. Oh, so they say. I don't know. I wasn't there. Although when I do know that my older brother, who's 7 years older than I am, when he was little, and mother would be on a show. If dad wasn't on the same show and was at home, they had a little game they'd play. Pick out mommy's voice. Because she'd be doing several different ones. And so if Andre could, that's her. Is that her? No. That's her. And so it went. Anyway, but in '65, the bottom dropped out of off-Broadway, as they say. And long and the short of it, my dad lost his dough. So we came to LA. And it was the mid-'60s. If we'd stayed in New York, things would have gotten just as weird. But with my little mind, of course, I didn't realize that. So I thought, we were going from something quasi-sane to insanity. Not realizing that New York would have gone the same way.
Right.
But, little kids don't think that way. Anyhow, we get there, and we shall we say, elected to 2 different things. My dad quickly realized that the amount of time it would take to get established in film, we'd all be dead. And he had a couple of kids to feed and raise now. So he had a background in engineering, and he fell back on it. And he signed up with a firm. Went to interview with them. It so happened that they had a bit of a problem. And the problem was that they had made a deal with Walt Disney to do the waterways of a new ride. Originally, the ride had been conceived of as a walkthrough. But Uncle Walt, because of the popularity of It's a Small World at the New York World's Fair, decided it would go through water.
Yeah.
And, Pirates, Maritime, and that was Pirates of the Caribbean. So if you ever take the ride, you're riding on my dad's design as far as the pathways go.
Wow.
So that's Dad's great external claim to fame. We settled in a house owned by a then famous phony. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say phony. That's very insensitive of me. Let me see. What's alternative?
Alternative. There you go.
That sounds a lot better. psychic named Criswell, who would later become famous through things like Plan 9 from Outer Space, which he introduces. And then the producer, director, and writer of that film, the late Edward D. Wood Jr., when he had a biopic made of him by Tim Burton, Criswell discovered a whole new generation of fans. So those people were the first people we met, other than folks that my parents already knew. My landlord, Mr. Criswell, would have a Sunday brunch, which was a real gathering of the bizarre. Unfortunately, it was on the front lawn rather than the back. So the maximum amount of embarrassment for a young kid. I don't want to press the point, but fortunately, at the same time, because we're now in 66, 67, 68, the great world was moving.
Right.
And we were both parishioners, and in my case, eventually, my brother immediately, school children at Blessed Sacrament Hollywood. And there, you know, parts of my life, not all, thank God, but parts, it felt a little bit like, oh heavens, you know, the film where the fellow keeps, he's a moron, but he keeps running into the great events of history. I can't think of it. You know, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
Forrest Gump.
Thank you, Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump. Yes.
From time to time, I've felt a little bit like Forrest Gump because I've run into things that I didn't know were great at the time. Although never anything as tremendous as Forrest Gump ran into. But my brother and I did find ourselves in the middle of the IHM nuns exploding in rage in 1968. Their Carl Rogers-induced trip. We got to share. And in a lot of ways, it helped form. It helped form my worldview because the ladies were quite obviously. I mean, they constantly prattled about being open and loving and blah 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 blah. Yeah. And of course, if you disagreed with them, they were harpies from hell. I mean that in a nice way. So the. No, I mean seriously. That was what it was like. It was the same way with the Jesuit priests. If you question the changes, which were very radical, you know, people are jumping up and down right now about the restrictions on the traditional mass and so on and so forth. But you've got to bear in mind that when this was first done, these 50 and 60 years ago, it was far more radical because far more alien. I mean, those of us who are old enough have been down this road before. With actually a lot of the same people, only then they were young, nasty priests who would come into a parish and break up the furniture and throw things around. It's, you will obey me because I'm wonderful. Well, no, you will obey me because I am wonderful.
Yeah. So you've seen this all before. It's and that's what I think a lot of people miss nowadays. This has been a long crisis. I mean, this has been going on for of course many years. In your time growing up, did you personally experience going from the traditional Latin Mass to seeing the reforms of Paul VI? Is that something that you saw in high school? What was that like?
No, not in high school. I was a lot younger. At the beginning of it, I don't remember. My earliest real memory would go back to 66, and I was, you know, I was a child. I was in first grade. But the summer of 66 was the summer they got rid of the last bit of Latin. See, it was done incrementally. And so when you say, well, the new Mass was brought in 1969, 1970, that's true, except that the quote-unquote old Mass looked very close to the new one. So, for instance, there was a change in the translation.
Yep.
The last version of the quote-unquote old Mass said for all. That change, I mean, I remember that. I remember my dad's rather caustic comments about it. He had a great sense of humor, my father. And believe me, he needed it. You know, to get through World War II by itself. It was a tail gunner against the Japanese. Right. And so he had a great sense of humor, but he didn't take a lot of guff. Because, as he used to say, if you're going to try to push me around and you're not at the business end of a Japanese submachine gun, there's not a lot to be said, is there? So anyway, so basically the Latin Mass vanished completely, and what we had was the Soto complete with guitars, and of course, what was unfortunate for us was that we were in a Jesuit parish. It was a conservative archdiocese, and in fact, there were many pastors in remoter places, Orange County, Glendora, and so on, who kept saying the traditional Mass with Cardinal McIntyre's permission.
Right.
He was really easy in terms of giving indults for that. But we were in a Jesuit parish. And not only were the authorized changes fast and furious, the experiments were odd.
Right.
I mean, we were versus populum early on, real early. And of course, that led to the old joke. One of the only two things that won't change is a Jesuit Mass.
Well, I think I've heard this before. What are the two answers?
The bread and the wine.
The bread and the wine.
Everything else, it's up for grabs. But the bread and the wine will stay bread and wine. Don't worry about it. But,
don't worry. One thing.
Yeah, one thing we stay close to. So, I mean, it was really kind of a shambles. But then we moved out to the San Fernando Valley, which it's a funny truth of life. But parents inevitably want to raise children precisely where the children don't wish to be raised. And I can assure you that my brother and I would have preferred staying in Hollywood than going out to the wilds of Lakeview Terrace.
Yeah.
But we didn't have that option, so off we went. And we were there for, we moved back to town in 74. So really only about 3 or 4 years, but it felt like an eternity. At any rate, well, I during the time, my last year in the Valley, I went to Guardian Angel School, which is still with us in Pacoima, California. At the time, it was almost all black. And so if I had any tendency toward white guilt, I don't have any.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I made a lot of friends there, so I knew, the one and the other, shall we say.
Right.
But if you're going to yap at me about privilege, I'll tell you where you can take it. And in a nice way, of course.
Right.
My father used to say the only real privileged people in our society are the wealthy and the stupid. And you can't always tell the difference.
It's true. Oftentimes, it's right.
Sometimes, especially if they get elected, then never mind. Anyway, move along. So, truth is, though, that then we moved back into town. And so I spent my junior high at Fabulous Virgin Junior High, 2 years. More stabbings than any other school in the city. They're very exciting place.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. I learned to read cholo writing, which is very, very few non-gangbangers can do that. And I'm not a gangbanger, so it was very instructive. But at the time, we lived in Grosha Center, and our church was this St. Brendan's, which is now almost all Filipino and Mexican. But I remember there was a very elderly Irish nun who taught catechism there. And she was, I can't even remember her name, but I can remember her determination, shall we say, that what was true and wouldn't change. So it's kind of obvious to me in thinking back that she didn't have a great deal of use for what had been going on.
Yeah.
But a big change happened to me, though, in 1974, in that I switched to Daniel Murphy High, which was a Catholic school, Dominican fathers at the time. Very good principal, Father Charles Lopez, very crazy scripture teacher. I don't want to mention Father Terence Riley, but that was his name, OP. His class was called "The Bible is Literature," which we dubbed "Why Genesis Ain't So."
Oh, that's how it usually ends up. Yeah, it's
Yeah, none of it's true. You don't have to worry about it, and that's good. But at the same time, as in when I was at Blessed Sacrament, my first few grades, so at Daniel Murphy, a lot of my classmates were the children of actors.
Yeah.
And I had a particularly poignant moment, you might say. One of the fellows that I immediately got on with at Murphy, I mean, like that, was a kid named Stu Beckman. Well, his father, I didn't know this, but his father had been at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts with my dad. And the very first parent-teacher day, there's my dad, there's Mr. Beckman. There's Guy, Henry. And they flew at each other, and Stu and I were like, God, get me out of here. But nevertheless, it was an interesting thing because it taught me, my father, although he had connections and so forth, was dead set against my brother and I becoming child actors. And a lot of our friends did as we were growing up, not school friends, obviously, but other friends. But Dad firmly nixed it. And of course, in retrospect, I can see why he did it. But
what were his reasons at the time? Because sometimes you do see that. You see these great, big families of people who, they're actors, and then their kids will be actors too, or at least there's some sort of pressure to, not be you're sort of in the shadow of your father. What was your father's reason for not wanting you to be a child actor?
Well, first it was moral. I mean, he didn't say that.
Right.
But he said child actors get exposed to a lot of things I don't want to be exposed to.
That's true. It's true.
It was that blunt. He said, that's the first thing. The second thing is that if you should do very, very well as a child actor, that'll be great. But if you then are unable, and most can't, some few do, but if you can't make the transition to adult acting, it will scar you in terrible ways for your life.
Yeah.
If you're going to make it as an actor, I want you to do it as an adult, when you can handle it, and when it'll carry you to the grave. I don't want you being a washed-up child actor. It's a terrible place to be. And he said, the third thing, frankly, is that he said the industry is changing tremendously right now, and you really need to see which way it goes.
Yeah.
There was a time, said he, when acting was a little better than prostitution. And he says, bear in mind, this is when they first started with nude scenes and all that.
Yeah.
He said, we may be going that route again. Said, so it was for those reasons, basically. And I was a bit annoyed, but, what are you going to do? And now, with decades behind me and having known a lot of people, he knew what he was talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely a danger there. I've seen it personally. I've seen many people, come out of being a child actor, and there's a sort of being a searching for where you're going to plant your feet, because you're sort of thrown into stardom, and then you have to find a new place to go. If we can jump back on something, one of your father's points, acting used to be something, a sort of degenerate thing you can do. And of course, the entertainment industry evolved. Can you maybe tell our audience a bit, how did we get to the point from that early form of the entertainment industry to really the glory days that we saw in the 40s and 50s, where even the Catholic Church had somewhat of a control over Hollywood and the entertainment industry?
Well, it was a long process. I mean, theater as we know it. I mean, you've got your Greek plays and so on and so forth, and they're all wonderful. But that's not where modern theater evolved from. Modern theater evolved from the miracle plays, the mystery plays of the Middle Ages.
Right. Yep.
Ultimately. Now bear in mind, people have always wanted to be entertained. It's a very important thing to bear in mind, always. But the nature of the people who did the entertaining and the regard in which they were held has changed over time. So if we fast forward very rapidly in England, and really, the reason why I'm dealing with theater is because all of our movie traditions, etc., evolved from theater.
Right.
So I mean, there's a point to it. So basically, you had a separation to varying areas, of course, in the 19th century. Legitimate theater, so-called, you had vaudeville, which were variety acts. And they were connected, believe it or not, with the medicine shows of the Old West. Again, people do anything to be entertained.
Yeah.
And so one of the things about the doctor, Dr. Quack's golden elixir, he'd sell it, but he'd have a traveling wagon filled with stuff. And then after the show, people would line up to buy bottles of Dr. Quack's elixir.
Yeah, talk about phonies, right? Goodness gracious.
Oh, wow! A lot of this stuff, it was basically combinations of booze and opium.
Yeah,
and it's good for what ails you, all right. three quick snorts of Dr. Quack's elixir, and you'll feel great.
Oh, you're great. Yeah, you're solid. Yeah,
you feel tremendous. Like you might be able to stand up, and you feel good. But the thing is that these went into various permutations in different places. I mean, British music hall, for instance. But actors were, generally speaking, not well regarded. They were like gypsies. They were, and again, these different groups sort of fed into each other. The gypsies, the tinkers, the actors, because a lot of the actors were traveling people.
Yeah.
And traveling people simply were not respectable. And this was the case so long as in America as the mid-19th century and in England. So if you know New York at all, you may be aware of two institutions. What's that?
A little bit, yeah.
Well, there's an Episcopal church called the Church of the Presentations, the Redemption, something like that. I forget. Anyway, nobody calls it by its proper name anyway. They call it the Little Church Around the Corner. And the reason why it got its name was that in the 1870s, 60s, something like that, a man named William Jefferson, an actor who would go on to make a fortune playing Rip Van Winkle all around the country. And he became fabulous and wealthy with estates in Louisiana and Massachusetts and so on. But anyway, a friend of his died. So he took him to the local Episcopal church. And the rector said, I can bury an actor for this church. Why don't you get a little church around the corner? Maybe they'll bury your friend. Well, he did. And there was a big funeral. And from that time on, actors in New York of the Episcopal faith would all go to the little church around the corner. And there is a Catholic equivalent in New York, St. Malachi's, the Actors' Chapel. And you see the same thing in London with St. Paul's Covent Garden for the Anglicans and Corpus Christi Maiden Lane for the Catholics. Because, again, they weren't respectable. But this began to change, believe it or not, with the growth in the late 19th, early 20th centuries of mass media. And the growth of great magazines, because people started getting reviewed and all this. Then the radio came, and not just the birth of radio drama, but also of radio news. So you could hear about these people. The big thing, of course, was the screen. The silver screen. And that had the eventual, in a very short time, the eventual result of switching the whole thing around. And of course, actors have always liked to affect high society. Than to behave in that fashion. Or at least they did. So, for instance, in London, early 19th century, actors are not welcome in most places. But there was a couple named Charles and Mary Lamb, who you may remember tales from Shakespeare, children's tales from Shakespeare, and things like that. they put that up. A number of other things. Interesting couple. They wrote a great deal, but they were very friendly to the actors of their time. And so Let's Go Round to the Lambs after the show became a general thing that people did. Well, fade in, fade out in the 1880s and 90s, group of English actors in New York, they want to start a club. And what do they call it? The Lambs Club, after Charles and Mary Lamb. But there are two other actors clubs in New York, all founded around the same time. Gosh, I can't remember what one of them was called because I've not been there. The Lambs I know, because my dad was a Lamb. And I know very well the Players Club off Gramercy Park, which was founded by, amongst other people, the late Edward Booth, the brother of John Wilkes.
Oh, wow.
And he gave his mansion to the club. And there was a proviso. And the proviso was that his bedroom be preserved the way it was on the night he died.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
So if you go to stay at the Lambs Club and you know to ask, they will show you Edwin Booth's bedroom.
Wow. Okay.
And I mean, it's and then a group in 1925, a group of Lambs came out to LA and founded the Masters Club, which was the first private club I ever belonged to. Masters and Masquers. So, and there I met a lot of very, very interesting people, I can tell you. But that there was a very definitely a feeling of a profession in those days, and that carried over into the early film industry. It also, a lot of early television was affected by vaudeville people like Milton Berle, George Burns, Bob Hope. These folks all got to start in vaudeville, but they lived long enough to make the transition first to the silver screen and then the little screen to television.
Yeah.
And they became, they went from being this sort of outcast tribe to becoming celebrities. And that, it all happened actually in a relatively short period of time. So my, as for my own experience, when I was in high school, another great effect on me, you might say, was running into James Francis Cardinal McIntyre by accident, who became my confessor. And like the eruption of the Immaculate Heart nuns, like like my dad's careful training, all of these were a big part of forming my faith the way it is.
Yeah.
He in turn, Cardinal McIntyre, that is, and now we're in the 70s, 75, 76, 75. No, 76. And the Cardinal believes that I'm having my faith slowly drained out of me through a lack of decent liturgy. He offered the Tridentine Mass, low Mass on a side altar every day, but that's not really the same thing as seeing liturgy as it should be done.
Right. True.
And in those days, the most popular processional hymn in the Archdiocese of LA was "Put Your Hand in the Hand of the Man." So he had a point. The long and the short of it was, he sent me to check out, knowing that I was not going to become an Episcopalian. He sent me to check out an Anglo-Catholic church in Hollywood called St. Mary of the Angels, which ironically had also been very much of an actor's church. And sometime later, when I brought my parents there, there was a little old lady named Millicent who was a member of the congregation. And she was a clothing designer in Hollywood, Millicent of Hollywood. That was her moniker. Millicent McCambridge, I think her name actually was. But she looks at my parents, they look at her, and she says, "Guy? Pat?" And Mother and Dad say, "Millicent?" Well, they had known her when she was Millicent of Broadway.
Oh.
And so from that time on, whenever I'd see her, she'd say, "And how are your parents, dear?" I'd say, "Oh, they're great." I just love those kids. Of course, people know about my parents as kids. I found a little unsettling, but
A little bit, yeah.
it just ain't no kids now, man. But no, at any rate, so that was my introduction. Short version. I could go on with the amazing revelation it was, and it was in a lot of ways. But in a sentence, that was my introduction to Anglo-Catholicism.
And when you say Anglo-Catholicism, the personal ordinariates didn't quite exist yet. If I'm correct,
They didn't exist at all.
Right.
And St. Mary's was actually ultimately, it was part of the foundation of the ordinariate, although it's not part of the ordinariate now. It never ended. Long and sad tale for another time. But suffice to say that out of the ferment of their leaving the Episcopal Church and several other parishes leaving the Episcopal Church, from that and the work of, amongst other people, their then rector and still a Catholic priest today, Father Jack Barker. When I hear that man offer the ordinariate mass, it takes me right back to my teenager years. I mean, but that was the beginning of the so-called pastoral provision.
Right.
And on the foundation of the pastoral provision, its internationalization by Pope Benedict the 16th led to the formation of the ordinariates. So it's ironic to me that I'm a canonical member of the ordinariate myself now, which is very, very rare for a cradle Catholic. But little did I know on Septuagesima Sunday of 1976 what lay in wait. So but from them, I met the Russian Catholics in El Segundo, the Church of St. Andrews. And I discovered the Byzantine Rite and one Father Fyodor Wilcock, S.J. So you take all of this stuff together. My parents, Cardinal McIntyre, St. Mary's, St. Andrews, Father Wilcock, etc. And that was pretty much my outre formation as a Catholic. And it's why I've never left the faith. So I've never stopped practicing. But it was very eclectic and, shall we say, a series of fortuitous events.
Well, yeah, and I think that's kind of rare, especially before the dawn of the internet, having such a variety of experiences. You have access to the Byzantine Rite, Anglo-Catholicism, and the Tridentine Mass. How did you go from being a child of actors to an advocate of monarchism? What did that? I'm sure it did. How did the influence of this wide variety of traditions lead you to become an advocate for monarchism, which you're quite well known for?
Well, a number of things. Firstly, my dad, of course, was very patriotic for the United States, but he was very proud of being French Canadian. And of course, it was Louis XIII who sent my first fathers to Quebec.
Yep.
We had Scots blood on his side, and that was Jacobite.
And Prince Charlie, yeah.
Yeah, Money Prince Charlie. I made a recent discovery. We knew that we descended from a man whose brothers had fought and died at Coloumbe. Well, we didn't know, and I just found this out very recently in the past couple of years. He himself was a veteran of Coloumbe.
Oh, wow.
Didn't know it. My dad would have loved, but his brothers didn't survive, but he did, and came to Canada in 1772. My mother's family were great fans of the Habsburgs and the Romanovs and so on. And her mother's family were, shall we say, old American colonials.
Yeah.
And, I had a certain affection for the Loyalists as a result. Now, these all, you might say, inoculated me against the knee-jerk anti-monarchism that people have. And I knew about the horrors of the French Revolution, and uncomfortable connections between the American and the French revolutions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in later years, I came to realize that the biggest difference was the amount of bloodshed. But a big part of the reason for that is that in continental countries, there's always a lot more opposition to revolution than there is in Anglo countries.
Mm.
We generally just take what we're given.
Yes.
And so our masters don't have to smack us around, or as many of us.
Mm.
But even at that, 100,000 Americans had to leave after the revolution, and that was not a small number of people.
No, yeah.
And the number of loyalists who stayed was much greater, including, get ready for tomorrow or the next day, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton's family and her husband's family.
Mm.
So they had to, my favorite American writers were Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe.
Mm.
And although they were all very patriotic on the one hand, they were also very sympathetic to monarchy on the other.
Mm-hmm.
Washington Irving, of course, wrote his great Life of Washington. One of the funny things about him, though, he was named after the great man and actually met him when he was like 5 years old. And is in New York when New York was the capital. And his nursemaid asked the president to bless the child, so she did.
Oh.
So he finally paid him back by writing a multi-volume biography toward the end of his life.
Wow. What's the source of Edgar Allan Poe's? You said sympathy for monarchism. I didn't know that about him. Did he have writing just about?
He lived in England, and he had a hatred of the mob, of democracy. If you read one of his funniest things, and again, he's known for his horror stories, but he also wrote a lot of very funny ones, although they've got kind of dark humor.
A little bit. Just a little bit, yeah.
It's called, it was called Some Words with the Mummy. And basically these scientific gentlemen revive a mummy from an Egyptian tomb. And they get him to speak and all that. And he's commenting on his civilization, what life was like and all that. He says, well, what happened to destroy your cultures as well? There were a series of evil kings, followed by the worst of all, who made all the others look good. Well, what was his name? I believe it was Mob.
Oh, that's quite nice. It's very true too. And so did you? Did you read yourself into taking the monarchist position, or did you have any other experiences that made you want to start advocating for monarchy?
We'll see. There are several things all at once. I mean, I like to say that when you look at American monarchists, they generally come in 4 different varieties. The first are what I would call philosophical monarchists. Yeah. These are people who are not particularly attached to any given dynasty, but they know their Johnson and their Burke, and they to say nothing of their Aquinas and their Aristotle, and so they know that monarchy per se is a superior form of government. So that's one kind. The second are what I would call religious monarchists. These are Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, Lutherans, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, who simply believe that their faith is most in accord with monarchy, as opposed to any other form of government. The third are emigres or their descendants, people who, like my parents, who have lingering loyalties to past dynasties in the countries from whence they came. And lastly, though not leastly, are the Anglophiles.
Yeah.
And these are folks who range all the way from dear sweet old ladies who really love their coronation china to and faithful PBS watchers to all the way to people who really know what the system is about and think that it works better than ours does. Now, mind you, that was easier to maintain 20 or 30 years ago than it is today. Because one of the great things about living today is that every existing system is turned to garbage. And that's beautiful. In a way,
yeah.
I mean, it's a level playing field.
True.
If it's all crap, what's not to like? And of course, in days gone by, people would accuse me of the equivalent of LARPing.
Yeah, of course.
My response today is that if you think you can get anything better than what we have now through any way at all, you're the LARPer.
Yeah.
Eat your sewage and have a good time with it.
Yeah, it's true. It happens all. You see that accusation with everything nowadays. You see it with anytime someone wants to make any sort of change, it's immediate. Well, you're just LARPing, which for anyone that doesn't know that term, it means live action role playing. It means you're not really sincere in what you're doing. You're sort of just pretending. Yeah, and it's an absurd accusation. Which one of those four would you say you identify most with? What's your primary identity, if you will, as a monarchist?
All at once.
What an answer, right? That's great.
I suppose I'm weakest in the Anglophilia department, to be honest. But even there, I mean, there are a couple of things I have to bear in mind. I'm French Canadian on my dad's side. I'm a Catholic because of King George III, the Quebec Act. I can't forget that it was denounced in the Declaration of Independence. And don't get me wrong, the United States are my country. I served in the National Guard and the ROTC. Luckily for me, during the quiet 80s, where our motto was "Sleep well, America. Your National Guard does." But, it would have been very, very different if I'd been stuck in the Forever War. My heart really goes out to you. You're already your elders, and to me, the kids that were put through all that, and continue to be put through it, because God knows, it's not like Vietnam where they're called baby killers. But thank you for your service is kind of cold compared to getting them something. It's a funny thing. My brother was a career not National Guard, Army reservist for 30 years. He was on active duty a number of times during that period. But if you really want to get him annoyed, now mind, he won't do this to people he doesn't know. He'll force himself to smile, but I tease him fairly consistently. All you have to do is say, "Thank you for your service." And it's like, because, as he put it to me, I remember how quickly those things turn around and how little that really means.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
It sounds nice, but when you look at the high numbers of suicides amongst our returnees, there's something really wrong there. And we take these kids' youth, we splatter it against the wall, and what do we give in return?
And it's even unfortunate that it's not even a matter of protecting our national identity, protecting our nation, because in many senses we've lost that. And something I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned your French Canadian heritage. You mentioned your Scots heritage and your identity as an American. And of course, you're living in Austria at the moment. Which one of these things do you think is your anchor? I know you don't necessarily need to have one, but which is the one that you would say you identify with most? What's central to you?
Oddly enough, it's the totality. I mean, I wouldn't be who I am if I didn't have these various influences. If you took one of them away, I'd be a very different man.
Yeah.
as my father explained it to me, our ethnicity, of course, is what God made us in our DNA.
Yeah.
Our place of birth is a place God put us on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And where we end up, once again, is where God put us on purpose. You know, my coming to Austria was the culmination of a series of unbelievable events that, like almost anything good in anybody's life. I mean, you take your own and you think back to meeting your wife, or your girlfriend, or your best friend, or whatever you like, or the best job you ever had, or the best book you've ever read. You look at the concatenation of events that was required for that to happen. You wouldn't believe it if you read it in a novel.
Right. True. Yeah.
If you looked how your parents met, trust me, you wouldn't believe it. You'd say, "What? Boy, be tripping." You know, it doesn't happen like that in real life, except it does constantly. We're not aware of it. We don't think about it. Anyway, this is called divine providence.
Yeah.
So, to answer your question, they're all part of my makeup. You know, I spent my first few years in the Valley of the Hudson, and that's very important to me. I love the Hudson Valley, and it'll always feel like home in a way LA doesn't. And yet, LA, it's gone down the tubes. But see, here too, I've seen this before because I saw Hollywood go down the tubes. When we came out to Hollywood, it was quite a nice place, but within 20 years, it was an utter dump. And then it's undergone something of a renaissance, thanks to the Walt Disney Company. It's been Disneyfied. But, well, I mean, they did the same thing with Times Square. You know, it's a funny thing. Some places to recover have to be Disneyfied. Other places, like downtown Cleveland, the people themselves kind of figure out there's a problem.
Yeah.
And they pull themselves together and they do something about it. And honestly, I think Clevelanders can be a lot more prouder of their downtown than New Yorkers or Angelinos can be of Times Square or Hollywood.
There's something very personal about it. There's something that comes from the people itself. We sort of nowadays, I think we lack a connection to our places because it's not something that we build up as a community, but it's oftentimes placed there either by a company or some other institution. Yeah, right. Or the government. That's right. Yeah.
And they'll, you know, which, I mean, don't get me wrong. Thank God they do. It's better to be that than a dump.
That's true. Right.
All right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, let's get a grip. But it would be better, in my humble opinion, if the locals said, you know what, we're tired of this being a hellhole. Let's do something. And then they actually put their noses to the grindstone. They overcome whatever differences they have, and they make it happen. Yeah. And as I say, Cleveland is a beautiful example of that. This is the city where the river caught on fire. I mean, you got to be
pretty bad. Yeah.
when your river catches on fire, you got a problem.
Yeah,
I think that was kind of a moment of truth for Cleveland. You know, it was sort of like the drunk waking up and looking at the empty bottle and saying, "Well, I don't know."
That's right. Yeah, a little bit. So, you know, you mentioned something about divine providence. How if you look at really any event in history, you can read that and be like, "That's unbelievable." And you see that throughout history. Like you said, you see it with our own personal lives. And I hope people that are listening to this or that watch your content and that might be a little skeptical of, well, how are we going to put a monarch in place? How are we ever going to restore culture? If you look back in history, any one of these events would have seemed impossible. And so I think that's a very good point. What would you say, sort of to wrap things up here, something I wanted to get your take on? There's a lot of young men, especially today, that are sort of struggling to find meaning in life, struggling to find a movement and a way to improve their lives and improve their communities. What advice would you give specifically to them as to what they can do, how they can move forward and start, like you said, building from the ground up, improving their communities, improving their lives?
Well, of course, the first thing, and mind you, what I'm going to say, don't think this is a step-by-step thing. In other words, you've got to wait until you've accomplished this before you can go on to that.
Right. Yeah.
Life isn't like that. You're very often doing 17 different steps of quote unquote self-improvement all at the same time.
Yeah.
But you always, of course, start with yourself. And my late father used to say, you can't make anyone else, you can't control anyone else. All you can do is be the kind of gentleman you think everyone else ought to be.
Mm.
So that's where it starts. So you look at yourself. Your faith comes first, of course, because that's reality.
Yeah.
Everything else partakes of a certain amount of fantasy. That is on the part of human beings. We like to gild everything. But the revelation the church has given us, that is the one source of truth in this life that you can be absolutely sure of.
Yeah.
You take the four creeds and then you go on from there. That is reality. That's truth.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be doing an article today or tomorrow for somebody or other. I'm calling it The Cost of Reenchantment.
Mm.
And the cost of reenchantment is accepting this terrible truth. And why is it a terrible truth? Well, it's a terrible truth because it says we're all fallen. We all need redemption. And that spits in the face of everything we're told.
Yeah.
You're a perfect shining star, just the way that you are.
Mm.
No, you're not. But on the other hand, you're not the worst either.
Mm.
And one thing you've got to bear in mind in life is you'll always have two poles to go between. And I don't mean right or left. I mean, every conceivable element of life has two separate poles you'll need to avoid, and they're different from each other. But at any rate, so you don't want to be presumptuous. You don't want to despair. In this particular area, those are the two poles you have to avoid.
Yeah.
Despair and presumption. You're constantly looking out to improve your prayer life, your sacramental life, and so on. Then you need to improve, of course, yourself physically if you're very weak. If you're not, don't worry about it. If you're able to rip telephone books apart, then okay, that's great. If not, well, but you do need to expand your knowledge. None of us know our faith. None of us know history. None of us know literature nearly as much as we could and should.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always, always, always more to learn. The minute you stop learning, you're dead. And ideally, that's the only time you should stop learning, is when you're dying. As soon as they put the sheet over your head, then feel free to stop learning new stuff. Until then, keep pushing. Then what you need to do, well, you search out like-minded individuals. You go to organizations that feel your interest. Mm-hmm. The church, of course, But from there on, you've got to look at your own particular interests and talents. And this is very, very important because you wouldn't have them if God hadn't put them there.
Mm-hmm.
If you happen to be a great pianist or you have an extraordinary interest in reenactment or in car mechanics or in tobacco or tea or whatever it is, go into it, explore it, participate fully in the life of whatever that is. Always bearing in mind that you have now a God-given mission to evangelize amongst the people that you're working with. And that is actually true at work. But it's we start with places that you actually enjoy being at.
Yeah.
And then you can go out a little bit further and look at where you happen to live, where you are. The local historical society, the local conservation people. They'll be filled with literature circles. They'll be filled with strange, peculiar people, I promise you. But,
definitely.
But if the goal, if A, they don't throw you out, and B, the goal is worthwhile. I mean, it's a thing, it's we've got to save the old Cartwright place. Why? Because it's a part of the history of this town of ours. It's the prettiest thing in 3 counties. We certainly couldn't build anything like it now. So let's keep the old Cartwright place, or the Mogaluk waterfall, or whatever it is, because you'll be working with people. You'll learn organizational skills, and this is very, very important for your future. If you have any kind of leadership at all, any leadership abilities, you've got to develop it. And the way you develop it is in organizations. And what is the essence of leadership? It's getting people to do them what you want them to do for their reasons. That way you're not dragooning them into line. They'll be far happier to follow your lead if they're doing it for their purpose. And country-wise, as long as it isn't immoral, obviously.
Yep.
You make sure they get what it is they came in for. Well, why am I working on protecting the old Cartwright house? Well, actually, I've got a tremendous interest in teak wood. There's teak wood all through. Great. You can gawk at that teak wood in your life. You can catalog it. You can take pictures. You can touch it. As long as you're here on Friday to be a docent, have at it, pal. Well, this way you're all getting what you want. You've got the free docent you need, and they get to exercise their interest in teak wood.
Right.
It takes all kinds, ladies and gentlemen. Never forget that. It takes all kinds.
Very true.
It's long. I mean, I don't have a great interest in teak wood. I got to be honest with you. I really don't.
I don't either. Yeah.
But you know what? I am excited, though, in a way, by someone who can come up to you. Not usually on the spectrum, but not always. They come up to you and say, the thing about teak, look here. You can say, this teak is obviously Indian teak, and I'd say this is from Madras. Well, it's not my interest, but actually it's part of the totality.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, we need people who have that kind of interest, not for our personal sakes, but for the greater good, for the common good.
Yeah.
And this year is another thing I would recommend highly, because it comes easy, unfortunately, in a hypercritical day. Very often today, when you hear someone being praised for something, or someone gets an award, etc., the first instinct is to criticize.
Yeah.
And to fault find. Well, other than perhaps living in mother's basement, where am I getting off doing that? And how am I threatened by them doing well at something? Yeah. The truth is, in fact, the opposite. Anybody who achieves anything, so long as it's, decent, is actually doing us all a favor. I don't care tuppence about the World Series. I really don't. But you know what? A lot of people do. And a lot of people are thrilled when somebody or other wins the pennant. And guess what? A lot of work goes into doing that.
Right. Yeah.
Could I play a decent game of baseball? Not on your tintype. So where would I get off? Unless it was coupled with some obvious horror, or evil, or whatever. Where would I get off criticizing people for wasting their time with this?
Yeah.
I mean, what is interesting to me very often, I have no real interest in the sport, but I'll tell you, the life of Babe Ruth is really interesting.
Yeah.
And yet you can't really understand Babe Ruth if you don't understand a thing or two about baseball.
Yeah.
I just resaw Field of Dreams recently for the first time since it came out. And apart from, once again, hearing my generation congratulate ourselves on how wonderful we are, You have no idea how wonderful it feels being one of us. But what?
Oh, no, it's it's.
No, I'm see. My problem is I'm a junior boomer.
A junior boomer. Yeah.
I was born in 1960, so like the boom ended in '64.
Right.
So my peers and I, our joke is that we're old enough to get all the opprobrium from you people, but too young to have gotten any of the benefits.
It was such an awful spot. Yeah,
it's really bad. We were stuck with the '70s. Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Well, you had ABBA though. That's something, It's
oh yeah, that's something, all right. And we had the Son of Sam. Great. And the Bicentennial Minute.
Right.
Yeah, we had Schoolhouse Rock. Oh yeah, we had it.
Peak of culture. Peak of culture. Yeah.
Peak of something. But my joke, to young people here, and I'll share it with you, is I don't want you guys to go out thinking that my generation ruined everything for you. No, heavens no. I want you all to think of it as though we left you a series of character building challenges.
I'll start seeing it as that. Yeah, I think many people can.
At least that's what I tell myself when I wake up at night in a cold sweat. Sorry, caught in the throat. But no, I mean, honestly, it is. That too has been the shadow of the boomer, quote unquote, has been or the generation of '68, as we say on this side of the water, has been a long one. And we really did mess up a whole lot of stuff. But the thing to bear in mind is that all of us are the creations of the history that we inherit.
Yeah.
My generation, the oldest of us, were in our 20s when the leadership of the church went crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the youngest among the clergy, the youngest members of the last generation, the oldest members of mine, who are now, who were then the hatchet men, not the initiators, not the originators of the bad ideas, but they're hatchet men. And like hatchet men everywhere, they're just not that bright. Yeah. And now they're in charge, and they want to see their work done before they're carted off to the cemetery. So they explode in senile rage. And I understand. I accept that. There's a comedian a couple of years older than myself, whose name escapes me, but he has a great line, which is, I wish the boomers would just die. Of course, the problem is that when they do, they're taking me with them. And I understand that. But when you look at everybody from the Holy Father on down, and you hear this womanish hysteria, in the ones like the latest, the Holy Father has just had all of Pope Benedict XVI's coats of arms removed.
I just saw that. Yeah, goodness gracious. Yeah. Yeah, it can seem like that. It seems like that. Yeah,
it does. It's an hysterical old lady having a fit.
Yeah,
and I wouldn't do this in real life, of course, but you feel like grabbing some of these people and sitting them down forcibly and saying, "There, Grandma. It's all right. You'll be better."
Yeah. And you and I, we were joking, of course, about some of these things of the current generation has been ruined. But I think the truth is a lot of young men would do well to take your advice. And I think if young men did do that, I think we can actually start seeing some improvement. We have a lot of problems with the modern age that we're in, but it's not necessarily unique. Every single generation has faced problems. I mean, of course, it wasn't that long ago where we had a generation having to go through World War II, the First World War, and I mean, as you mentioned, the Vietnam War as well. So people can take concrete steps to improve their situation. I think you've given them a great deal of hope. So thank you for that.
I just point out two things. One is that today is January 3rd, which was J.R.R. Tolkien's birthday.
Yeah.
Now, he went through World War And as he put it very poignantly, by the end of the war, all but one of his closest friends were dead.
That's rough. Yeah.
It's very rough. But from the horror and the joy of his life and from his faith, he'd be the first one to tell you this, he made Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Which has been a staff of life to God knows how many people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that, we're obviously not all Tolkien's by any stretch. But the fact is that if you're handed a harsh thing, you try to make the best of it. And
Right.
the two things you have to avoid, and this is absolutely top. Remember, at the end of the day, we're talking about our individual salvation.
Mm-hmm.
The devil, who goeth about as a lion, seeking whom he may devour, wants us to do two things. He wants us to hate, and he wants us to despair, because these are the only emotions he has left. And so, above anything else, when you find yourself falling into the hatred or despair, stop.
Yeah.
Just stop it. If you're, if you're feeling hate towards someone, say a prayer for them. Even if it's a little old lady cleric who's, wrecking everything around her, pray for her, because you don't want her to die.
Right.
With this, I came to an interesting realization some few years ago, which is that of all the people I've actually met, and some of whom I have utterly despised, I've had utter contempt for, there's not one of them I'd want to see fry forever.
Yeah, of course.
Maybe smacked around pretty good, but not simply frying forever. And thinking about the four last things, and particularly the enormity of hell, yeah, it's good for us, but it's also good for avoiding hatred of other people. Because now, and mind you, there will be exceptions. If somebody molested your kid brother, I'm afraid you probably will want him to go to hell. You should try not to.
Yeah.
But there are.
Yeah.
I know he murdered my wife, but on the other hand, he was good to his dog. Well, yeah. I'm not going to ask you to do that.
Yeah, there's exceptions.
God may not make those exceptions, but I think they'll understand if we have trouble with them. But the other is the temptation to despair. And so what do? You look at everything that's good. That's good in your life. That's good around you. It's one of the reasons why, the old Cartwright house or so-and-so winning the World Series, whatever gives you good, innocent pleasure. The thing is, we are such stuff. We should be able to think immediately of the Blessed Trinity and the Holy Eucharist. Unfortunately, we're not really like that.
Right.
So the trick is to first pull away from the immediate. So it's horrible forever, and then you say, well, I really like green sleeves. It's really pretty. And then you think, yeah, and of course it's also used for what child is this? And then you start thinking of the babe of Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Try to train yourself when you begin to despair and see, and just it all seems dark. To pull back, zero in on something you like, and then relate that something you like to the highest good, because all these goods come from God, the giver of all gifts.
Yeah,
That's very true. It is. There isn't a single good thing in your life that God didn't give you. Usually through, he even himself, he mediates through bread and wine. So he's real big on this whole mediating thing, and that's probably just as well, because I don't I can wait until the final judgment to see him face to face. I think if
Yeah.
he appeared, if I had an apparition right here, right now, I don't think I'd handle it very well.
Yeah, that mediating thing is kind of his thing. So absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's such good advice, Charles. And thanks so much for coming on again. And again, if you want to see more of Charles's work, you can go over to Tumblr House. You can see him on the Off the Menu podcast or purchase some of his books. And if you want to support Catholic Family News, our January issue has just come out, and you can become a subscriber there on CatholicFamilyNews.com. So thanks so much for joining us, Charles.
Glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. God bless.
God bless you. Happy New Year.
You as well.